Welcome to the present path, where forgotten truths, strange histories, and hidden meanings come alive. Here stories aren't just told, they're felt. If you crave calm, curiosity, and quiet revelations, you're in the right place. Let your mind wander. Let the past whisper. Let the paradox begin. You were listening to a war that wasn't really a war. Or maybe it was. But maybe not for the reasons people said. The headlines were simple. 2 countries, a football match, and then tanks. The story was too strange to ignore, too neat, to question a war over a game. But like most truths repeated too easily, the real story lies somewhere underneath. Imagine waking up in a small Honduran town in 1969. The sun is already hot, and your family is already worried. Not about the match, but about the land. About the quiet whisper that there may not be enough space, enough food, enough work. Not for you, not for your neighbor, not for the Salvadoran farmer who moved in 2 years ago and built a home out of rusted tin and banana leaves. You feel it. Not hatred, not yet. Just pressure, a shared breath that's too shallow, a glance that's too long, a silence that fills the space before a riot. Now imagine you are in El Salvador. You've traveled hours just to get a ticket to the game. You believe in your team, not because they're better, but because they have to be. You believe in them the way a nation bleeding from its borders believes in symbols. You've seen the land shrink, the population swell, and the promise of escape disappear. And so, when the ball hits the net, it feels like vengeance, like justice, like something bigger than a score. In July 1969, Honduras and El Salvador played each other in a 3-game World Cup qualifier. The matches were fierce, violent, and politically charged. The final game ended with El Salvador severing all diplomatic ties with Honduras. 5 days later, bombs fell from the sky. But here's where the story begins to unravel. Because this wasn't really about football. The match was a spark, but the fuel had been there for years. Land reforms in Honduras had displaced thousands of Salvadoran immigrants. Tensions over property, borders, and migration simmered until they boiled over. The war lasted only 100 hours. Roughly 6,000 people died. And when it ended, nothing was resolved. Journalists needed a headline. They called it the football war. A war that didn't make sense. A war that made too much sense. But here's the trap. We like tidy stories. We like the absurdity of 2 nations going to war over a game. Because if the war was absurd, then we don't have to look deeper. We don't have to ask about land inequality, or forced migration, or what happens when desperation outpaces diplomacy. Wars don't begin when the first shot is fired. They begin in quiet decisions, in ignored warnings, in policy meetings, closed doors, and whispered fears. They begin when the world is too full and too fragile, and someone, somewhere, decides to push. The football war is remembered as one of history's most pointless conflicts. But there's nothing pointless about 6,000 dead. There's nothing amusing about the hunger, the poverty, the pressure that led there. What makes this war so misunderstood isn't the football match. It's the fact that we believed that was the story. It's how easily we accepted the distraction. How quickly we let symbolism replace substance. So here's the paradox. A war remembered for the wrong reason, because the real reasons were too ordinary, too slow, too sad to fit in a headline. You're drifting now. But before you do, ask yourself, if a war is misunderstood by everyone who remembers it, Did we ever really understand it at all? It began with an ear, severed, pickled, and presented like a relic of grievance. But ears don't start wars. Not really. They only serve as symbols when the truth is harder to sell. This is a war most have forgotten, and those who remember it for the wrong thing. The story told is theatrical. In 1731, British captain Robert Jenkins had his ship boarded by Spanish coast guards in the Caribbean. They searched his vessel for contraband, part of Spain's effort to enforce its colonial monopoly in the Americas. When Jenkins resisted, the Spaniards allegedly cut off his ear. Years later, Jenkins brought that severed ear to Parliament, held in a jar. He showed it as proof of Spanish cruelty, of national humiliation. It was enough. 8 years after the incident, Britain declared war on Spain. That's the version that makes it into history books. Clean, strange, easy to repeat. But history is rarely clean, and wars almost never strange for the reasons they claim. By 1739, Britain and Spain were already circling conflict. Both empires hungered for control of trade routes in the Caribbean and Central America. Treaties were being ignored. Boundaries were being tested. British merchants, especially those trading slaves, were pushing deeper into Spanish territories. Spain retaliated with coastal patrols and brutal searches. Tension was constant, and profit was threatened. Jenkins' ear was not the cause. It was the pretext, you see. There's a pattern in war. A single story, dramatic, grotesque, becomes the excuse. But the war was already written. Long before the jar, the ear, or the speech in Parliament. For 8 years, Jenkins' tale had been known, ignored, forgotten. But when political winds shifted, when hawks in Parliament needed a rallying cry, the ear re-emerged. It was no longer just flesh. It was a flag. And so Britain went to war. But not just with Spain. This conflict morphed, expanded, and folded into what would later become the War of the Austrian Succession. The lines blurred. The reasons evaporated. By the time peace was declared in 1748, few remembered Jenkins. Even fewer cared the irony. The war accomplished almost nothing. No territory gained. No major trade advantage secured. No real resolution to the grievances that supposedly began it. A war sparked by a body part that ended in a stalemate. A war remembered by its oddity, not its bloodshed. And here lies the misunderstanding. We think absurdity means triviality. We laugh at the year and forget the corpses. We mistake spectacle for substance. But the truth is, absurdity is often the veil, not the cause. It's the bait. What really drives war is invisible. Economics, ambition, imperial inertia. The War of Jenkins' Ear wasn't a joke. It was a colonial chess move, one in which thousands of people died in sweltering jungles, on open seas, and in mosquito-ridden ports, all for the illusion of honor and control. And now the question loops back. If a war is remembered for its punchline, did we ever understand the cost? So you close your eyes. You feel the slow burn of history's forgotten fever, and you wonder if an ear can start a war. What other body parts have been offered to justify an empire? It was just a pig. One pig, rooting in the wrong garden, on the wrong island, at the wrong time. You might think this is a joke, but it nearly became a war between two nations, all because one man pulled a trigger and one pig fell dead in the grass. The year was 1859. The place, San Juan Island, nestled between Vancouver Island and the mainland of what is now Washington State. At the time, this land was disputed. Both the British and the Americans claimed it. And yet, both lived there. British settlers from the Hudson's Bay Company and American pioneers staking quiet farms. For the most part, it was peaceful, polite, tense, but manageable until the pig. The pig belonged to Charles Griffin, a British employee of the Hudson's Bay Company. It had a habit of wandering into the garden of an American farmer named Lyman Cutler. One day, Cutler had enough. He shot the pig. When Griffin found out, he was furious. He demanded compensation. Cutler offered $10. Griffin wanted more. Neither would yield. What followed wasn't laughter. It wasn't absurdity. It was escalation. British authorities threatened to arrest Cutler. American settlers demanded protection. The U.S. Army dispatched 66 soldiers to the island. The British responded with 3 warships. Soon, more than 2,000 men stood ready for battle, all because of a pig. But of course, it wasn't really about the pig. It never is. The pig war was a symptom, not a cause. The deeper truth. The Oregon Treaty of 1846, meant to settle the U.S.-British border in the Pacific Northwest, had been written in vague language. It stated the boundary should run through the middle of the channel between the mainland and Vancouver Island. But there were 2 channels. The British favored one. The Americans favored the other. San Juan Island lay between them. And so, when the pig was shot, it wasn't just about a farm animal. It was about sovereignty, territory, the friction between maps and meaning. What makes this war misunderstood is not its absurdity. It's that it wasn't a war at all. Not a single shot was fired beyond that pig. Not a single human died. It was called a war because the potential was there. Because soldiers stood ready, muskets loaded, artillery aimed, waiting for someone to make the wrong move. And that's the paradox. The pig war is remembered as a farce, a comedy of errors. But it was one decision, one breath away from catastrophe. It's easy to mock. But history is full of wars that started over less. Think of it this way. Sometimes the loudest wars begin with silence, with the tension of paperwork, with the misreading of a treaty, or a pig grazing in a place it shouldn't. The pig war didn't end with a treaty. It ended with time. A peaceful, joint occupation continued for 12 more years. Finally, in 1872, an international arbitration ruled in favor of the United States. The British accepted it. The troops left, and the pig, long dead, became a punchline. But here, as always, is the trap. We remember the war that didn't happen, because it feels safer than the ones that did. We tell the story to prove diplomacy works, but behind it lies the knife's edge, the reminder that entire nations have burned for less. So, as you drift into the edges of sleep, you might ask yourself, if one pig nearly triggered a war, what is your world balanced on right now? You're holding a rifle, you're standing in a wheat field, and your enemy is running, not toward you, but away. Dozens of them, hundreds, feathered, flightless, fast. This isn't a joke. Not entirely. This was a war. And in this war, the birds won. The year was 1932. The place, Western Australia. Thousands of World War I veterans had been given land to farm, a government effort to reward their service and build a new agricultural frontier. But the land was difficult. The soil was dry, and the economy was collapsing under the weight of the Great Depression. Then came the emus, over 20,000 of them, large, fast, and migratory. They descended upon the farmland like a moving tide, trampling fences, devouring crops, and evading all attempts to scatter them. The farmers, desperate, called the government for help, and the government answered with soldiers, with machine guns, with ammunition. The Emu War had begun. Major G.P.W. Meredith of the Royal Australian Artillery was deployed with 2 Lewis guns and 10,000 rounds of ammunition. His mission: suppress the emus, but it didn't go as planned. The emus moved in scattered groups, too fast and agile for heavy weaponry. The terrain was rough, the birds unpredictable. Machine guns jammed, ambushes failed, shots were fired, thousands of them, but the birds kept running. Reports from the time were humiliating. On one occasion, soldiers opened fire on a group of 1,000 emus, only to kill a dozen before the rest vanished into the brush. Another day they managed to kill only 50 emus with 2,500 rounds. Meredith famously noted, "If we had a military division with the bullet-carrying capacity of these birds, it would face any army in the world." Eventually, the operation was abandoned. The birds had outmaneuvered the soldiers. Australia had lost its war against emus. But what makes this war truly misunderstood isn't just the absurdity, it's the deeper irony. This wasn't a war against nature. It was a war against a symptom. The real enemy wasn't the emus. It was drought. It was failed economic policy. It was the idea that a machine gun could fix a broken agricultural system. The Emu War reveals something quietly tragic. When faced with collapse, governments often respond with force, even when the problem is beyond bullets and the soldiers. They weren't laughing, they were humiliated, because they weren't fighting enemies, they were fighting shadows, fighting the emptiness that comes when nothing else seems to work. This wasn't war, this was projection. And now, decades later, we remember it only as a joke. The birds won, the soldiers lost. End of story. But beneath that laughter is something else. The Emu War is a reminder that not all wars are fought for power. Some are fought out of panic. Some are waged in the absence of ideas. Some are declarations of helplessness. So now you're drifting. The field is quiet again. But if you listen carefully, you can still hear them. Feathers brushing through golden grass. A war machine jammed in the heat. Men watching birds and not knowing what to do next. So ask yourself, when we laugh at the wars that failed, are we laughing because they were harmless, or because we recognize how close we are to doing the same thing? It was an old bucket, wooden, worn, and perfectly ordinary. But when it was stolen, thousands died. This is the war of the oaken bucket. And no, it's not a metaphor. The bucket was real in 1325. Tensions simmered between 2 Italian city-states, Modena and Bologna. Both were proud, both were powerful, and both belonged to opposing sides of a broader European divide. Modena with the Ghibellines, who supported the Holy Roman Emperor. Bologna with the Guelphs, loyal to the Pope. This was not a time of peace. Italy, fractured and feuding, was a patchwork of alliances and betrayals. Honor was currency, reputation, everything. So when a band of Modenese soldiers slipped into Bologna and stole a wooden bucket from a city well, it wasn't just theft, it was provocation. The bucket was paraded through Modena like a trophy, an insult, a dare. Bologna demanded its return. Modena refused, and so Bologna declared war. Historians debate whether the bucket was the true cause, or merely the final straw. The feud had been brewing for years over borders, trade routes, and ancient rivalries. But the bucket became the symbol, the spark. The war lasted just one battle, the Battle of Zappolino. Over 30,000 troops fought. The fields ran red with blood. The Modenese emerged victorious, and the bucket, it stayed in Modena. It still sits in a tower to this day, suspended in iron behind glass, a reminder of what pride can cost. We laugh now, a war over a bucket. How absurd. But the absurdity is the disguise, because this wasn't about the bucket. It was about identity. The bucket was a placeholder, a stand-in for centuries of tension, a symbol that let cities bleed for something they could name, because if they fought over land, it would get complicated. If they fought over politics, it would demand explanation. But a bucket that was simple, tangible. Wars need symbols. They anchor rage. They justify sacrifice. And in that sense, the War of the Oaken Bucket wasn't strange at all. It was textbook. Here's the trap. The more absurd the cause seems, the more it conceals the truth. Modena didn't fight for wood. It fought for honor, for dominance, for a seat in a shifting world of power and influence. And Bologna didn't march to recover a bucket. It marched because it couldn't be seen as weak, because silence would mean surrender. So what makes this war misunderstood isn't the object. It's the illusion that the object was ever the point. Think of your own life. Think of the fights that started with dishes, with glances, with words that meant something else. The bucket was never about the bucket. Just like most wars are never about what they say they are. Now, in this quiet moment before sleep, you're standing in the courtyard of Modena's tower. The bucket hangs there still, untouched for centuries, not because anyone needs it, but because no one can afford to forget it. And now the question settles over you. If a wooden bucket can start a war, what are we fighting over that we no longer recognize as meaningless? It was one of the deadliest wars in human history. More than 20 million people died. Some say as many as 30 million. And yet, most have never heard of it, and those who have rarely understand it. This is the Taiping Rebellion, a civil war that nearly broke China in half, led by a man who claimed to be the brother of Jesus Christ. Let that sit with you for a moment. His name was Hong Xiuquan. Born in 1814 in southern China, he failed the imperial exams multiple times. He was bright, ambitious, but rejected. The failure broke him, or perhaps it opened him. After falling into a fever, he claimed to have received visions. He saw a Heavenly Father. He saw demons wearing Qing official robes. He saw himself as the Son of God. When he recovered, he had a purpose. He was not just a scholar now, he was a prophet. Hong began to preach a new religion, a strange fusion of Christianity, Confucian morality, and political revolution. He called it the Heavenly Kingdom. Its goal, to overthrow the Qing dynasty and establish a divine, egalitarian rule on earth. People listened, especially the poor, especially those crushed under the weight of taxes, corruption, and famine. By 1850, his movement had grown into a full rebellion. What began as sermons became armies. What began as visions became violence. Cities fell. The Taiping controlled vast swathes of southern China. At one point, they ruled over 30 million people. Their capital, Nanjing, renamed Tianjin, the heavenly capital inside this kingdom. Men and women were supposedly treated equally. Private property was abolished. Alcohol, opium, and and gambling were banned. It was, in theory, a moral utopia. But theory doesn't survive war. What makes the Taiping Rebellion misunderstood is not just its scale, but its complexity. It wasn't simply a religious war, or a peasant uprising, or a power struggle. It was all of these things, and none of them entirely. Western powers didn't know what to make of it. Was this Christian revolution good, or dangerously radical? In the end, they sided with the Qing, and the rebellion was slowly, brutally crushed. The heavenly kingdom collapsed. Hong Xiuquan died in 1864, likely by poison or starvation. His body was buried, then dug up, cremated, and blasted out of a cannon. The Qing wanted to erase him, to scatter the ashes of his dream. But dreams don't scatter so easily. The paradox is this: a war so vast, so bloody, so transformative, forgotten, not because it was unimportant, but because it didn't fit the narrative. It wasn't East versus West. It wasn't good versus evil. It was confusion incarnate. And history doesn't know what to do with confusion, so it disappears. But tonight, as you drift through dim fields and ancient capitals, you might glimpse the silhouette of Hong Xiuquan, a failed scholar turned messiah, a prophet of ruin. And you might ask, if a man believes he's divine, and millions die for that belief, does history call him mad because he failed? Or because he almost succeeded? It lasted just 38 minutes, a war shorter than a lunch break, and yet it still left people dead, buildings destroyed, and power redrawn. This is the Anglo-Zanzibar War, officially the shortest war in recorded history. But the real story stretches longer, and the misunderstanding, it lies in what brevity hides. The date was August 27, 1896. Zanzibar, an island off the coast of modern-day Tanzania, had long been under the influence of the British Empire. Technically independent, but only if it obeyed. When the pro-British Sultan Hamad bin Thuwaini died suddenly, his cousin Khalid bin Bargash seized the throne. He declared himself ruler without British approval. It was bold. It was fast. It was not tolerated. The British gave Khalid an ultimatum: step down by 9 a.m. the next morning. He refused. He barricaded himself in the palace. He gathered 3,000 defenders, many of them civilians. He raised the Sultan's flag high above the rooftops. At exactly 9:02 a.m., British warships in the harbor opened fire. Within minutes, the palace was burning. The Sultan's forces returned fire, but it was futile. By 9:40 a.m., the flag was down. The war was over. Khalid had fled through a back door and sought asylum in the German consulate. On paper, it was a quick war, efficient, bloodless for one side, devastating for the other. But here's where the misunderstanding begins. Because what happened in those 38 minutes was only the final punctuation mark on a sentence written long before. Zanzibar had been a center of the East African slave trade for centuries. It was a crossroads of empire, trade, and violence. And Britain's interest in the region had less to do with morality and more to do with control of resources, of shipping routes, of influence in a fading world map of colonized ambition. Khalid's defiance wasn't random. It was rooted in the friction between old powers and new ones, between sovereignty and puppet rule, between a throne and a flag, neither of which could be freely chosen. The Anglo-Zanzibar War is remembered for its speed, its absurd duration, but what's lost in that number, 38 minutes, is the long shadow of imperial power. The palace that burned wasn't just bricks, it was identity. It was independence. It was the last flicker of resistance before British dominance sealed itself with cannon, smoke. And yet, we laugh. We call it a fun fact. We list it among trivia, because short wars don't feel serious. They feel like errors, like accidents. But 500 Zanzibaris were killed or wounded. 500 people, in less than an hour. And the British, one sailor injured. Imbalance doesn't need time to be profound. Power doesn't need days to assert itself. So the paradox remains, a war defined by its brevity, but stretching backward into centuries of domination, and forward into decades of colonial residue. Now the waters of the Indian Ocean are quiet again. The palace has been rebuilt. Tourists visit. Souvenirs are sold. But beneath the waves, the echoes linger, not in minutes, but in meaning. So ask yourself, as you drift, if a war lasts 38 minutes, but its consequences endure for lifetimes. How long did the war really last? It began with a broken bakery window, and it ended with a naval bombardment, foreign occupation, and the seeds of deeper conflict. This is the Pastry War, a name so strange it almost demands disbelief. A war over dessert. But this was no joke. And the pastry was just the surface. The setting, Mexico, 1830s, a young republic, still reeling from independence, revolutions, and internal fractures. Stability was fragile. Violence was common. And for foreign residents, especially Europeans, the streets of Mexico City could be dangerous. One such resident was a French pastry chef named Monsieur Remontal. He claimed that Mexican officers had looted his shop during a riot in 1828. They'd eaten his pastries, smashed his windows, and never paid. Remontal demanded compensation. The Mexican government refused. Years passed, the issue forgotten, until the French government, under King Louis Philippe, resurrected the complaint. Not just for Remontal, but on behalf of multiple French nationals who claimed they'd suffered losses in Mexico. They demanded 600,000 pesos in reparations. An outrageous sum, especially for the time. Mexico hesitated, negotiated, stalled, and then France acted. In November 1838, the French Navy blockaded Mexico's Gulf Coast. By December, they were bombarding the fortress of San Juan de Ula near Veracruz. Mexican defenses crumbled. French troops occupied the city, all for a pastry shop. Or so the story goes. But here's the truth, hiding beneath the frosting. France didn't care about the bakery, not really. The pastry war was about leverage, about asserting dominance in Latin America, a region France feared was slipping into exclusive American and British spheres of influence. It was about testing a young, unstable Mexico, and proving that European power could still flex across oceans. Remonto's bakery was the excuse, a convenient symbol, a tale that could be wrapped in righteous indignation, even if it was decades old. Mexico, humiliated and weakened, turned to a familiar name, Antonio Lopez. The Santa Ana Jez, the same Santa Ana who would soon lose Texas, the same Santa Ana who would rise and fall from power multiple times. He rallied Mexican troops, faced off against the French, and in a strange twist of fate, lost a leg in battle. That leg would later become a national symbol, buried with honor, mourned as if it were a martyr. Eventually, with British mediation, the war ended. Mexico agreed to pay the demanded sum. The French withdrew. The bakery had been avenged, but the deeper story had already begun. because the pastry war planted a seed. It revealed Mexico's vulnerability to foreign intervention. And just 7 years later, the United States would seize that vulnerability and push it even further in the Mexican-American War, a conflict far bloodier, far longer, and just as misunderstood. So here's the paradox: a war remembered for its absurdity, that masked a profound truth. We often dismiss conflicts with strange names. We think absurdity equals insignificance, but the opposite is often true. Absurdity is camouflage. It hides the hands pulling the strings now. As you settle deeper into stillness, imagine that bakery in the quiet streets of Mexico City, shattered glass, scattered pastries, and history waiting just beyond the window, and ask yourself if war can be justified by cake. What else have we swallowed without question? The dog didn't know it had crossed a border. It just ran from noise, from instinct, from whatever fear drives an animal to bolt into the unknown. But by the time it stopped, soldiers were dead, flags were raised, and two nations stood on the edge of war. This is the War of the Stray Dog. It happened in 1925 between Greece and Bulgaria, and though the name sounds almost fictional, the blood spilled was very real. It began on the border near the town of Petric. A Greek soldier, chasing after his dog, crossed into Bulgarian territory. It was an accident. But borders, especially in the Balkans, are rarely simple. Bulgarian sentries opened fire. The Greek soldier was shot and killed. What followed was not diplomacy. It was escalation. The Greek government demanded an apology. They demanded compensation. Bulgaria hesitated, cautious, unprepared, uncertain. So Greece invaded. They sent troops across the border. They occupied towns. Bulgarian civilians fled. Skirmishes erupted. Dozens were killed. All of it sparked by a misunderstanding, or so it seems. But wars, even strange ones, rarely begin in a vacuum. The dog was not the cause, only the trigger. The deeper truth lies in the long shadow of the First World War and the even longer, bitter history of Balkan territorial disputes. After World War I, the Treaty of Neuilly had redrawn maps. Greece and Bulgaria both nursed grudges, both had suffered losses, both felt humiliated. This was a region scarred by shifting lines, failed alliances, and buried revenge. So when the dog ran and the soldier followed, it wasn't an isolated incident, it was a match falling into a dry forest. What makes this war so misunderstood isn't just its absurd origin, it's how quickly it almost became something much larger. The world watched. The League of Nations intervened. For once, an international body acted with surprising speed. They demanded Greece withdraw. They warned of sanctions. They sent observers, and remarkably, Greece complied. Within weeks, the soldiers returned home, reparations were paid, and the war ended almost as suddenly as it began. No treaties, no parades, no heroes, just silence. The War of the Stray Dog is often remembered as a footnote, an absurdity, an anecdote. But here's the trap. We think absurd wars are harmless. We think they reveal something cute about human conflict. But really, they expose how fragile peace is, how little it takes to reignite old fires. If a dog can provoke an invasion, what else might we misread? What else might we escalate by accident, because we refuse to let go of old maps and older wounds? Tonight, as you drift into sleep, you might picture that dog still running, unaware that its path once carved through the edge of war, and you might wonder if peace can be broken by an animal's panic. What, exactly, have we built it on? No gunfire echoed across the North Atlantic, no battlefields soaked in blood, and yet this was still called war. This is the story of the Cod Wars, not one war, but three, fought not with bombs, but with boats, not for conquest, but for fish. It began in 1958, when Iceland extended its fishing zone from 4 to 12 nautical miles, a small change on paper, a seismic one at sea. Britain, a maritime titan with centuries of dominance, refused to recognize the new boundary. British trawlers continued fishing in Icelandic waters. Icelandic patrol boats responded with nets, cables, and eventually ramming. It sounds like a skirmish, a dispute, something for diplomats to resolve, but it escalated. British warships were deployed to escort the trawlers. Icelandic gunboats threatened to cut their nets. Collisions became frequent. Steel slammed into steel, and beneath it all swam the real cause. Cod. To most, cod is just dinner. To Iceland, it was survival. In the 20th century, fishing made up a significant portion of Iceland's economy, sometimes over 90% of its exports. Cod wasn't just a commodity, it was identity. It was independence. So when other nations dragged nets through Iceland's waters, it wasn't just about fish, it was about existence. The first Cod War ended with a reluctant agreement, but Iceland would push again to 50 nautical miles in 1972, then to 200 miles in 1975. Each time, Britain resisted. Each time, conflict returned. Each time, Iceland escalated with surprising courage. They were a tiny country, no navy to speak of, no army at all, but they had leverage. In 1976, Iceland threatened to close a critical NATO base, a strategic post in the Cold War chessboard that got attention. The United States pressured Britain, and Britain, reluctantly, backed down. Iceland had won. But here's the misunderstanding. We think wars must be violent to be real, that without blood there is no cost. Yet in the Cod Wars, there were consequences. Tensions within NATO, economic disruptions, lives at risk as boats collided in freezing waters, and beneath it all, a deeper truth that the world was changing. That the empires of old, with their flags and fleets, were losing control. Iceland showed something radical, that a small nation, if stubborn enough, could bend giants. And Britain, they weren't just defending cod, they were defending the memory of empire, the illusion that the sea still belonged to them. The Cod Wars are rarely taught, rarely understood, because they don't fit the script. They feel undramatic, ridiculous even. But they were among the first modern resource wars, fought not for land, but for sustainability, not for ideology, but for survival. And now, as climate shifts and oceans rise, the echoes grow louder, because cod wasn't the end, it was the beginning. So as your thoughts quiet and the sea grows still beneath you, ask yourself, if war can be fought over a fish, what happens when the fish are gone? The map makers never expected resistance. They drew lines in ink, borders that assumed conquest, borders that spoke with European certainty. But Ethiopia did not agree. This is the first Italo-Ethiopian War, a conflict where an African empire defied colonization, where a European power expected a parade, and instead received a disaster. The year was 1895. Italy, newly unified and desperate to prove itself, looked to Africa, the other European empires. Britain, France, Belgium had already carved the continent like meat on a table. Italy wanted a slice. It claimed Eritrea. Then it set its eyes on Ethiopia, or Abyssinia, as it was then known. But Ethiopia wasn't empty land. It wasn't waiting to be discovered. It was an empire. It had a leader, Emperor Menelik II. It had armies, traditions, alliances, and it was watching. In 1889, Italy signed the Treaty of Wuchali with Menelik. But there were two versions, one in Italian, one in Amharic, and the Italian version claimed Ethiopia as a protectorate of Italy. Menelik disagreed. He tore up the treaty. He prepared for war. Italy advanced, confident, dismissive, colonial arrogance wrapped in polished boots. But what they didn't expect was how ready Ethiopia truly was. Menelik had spent years stockpiling modern weapons. He had forged diplomatic ties with Russia and France. He had united rival tribes. He had studied the invaders, and he was not afraid. The final battle came at Ottawa. In March 1896, the Italians were outnumbered nearly 2-1. Worse, they were poorly supplied and led by commanders who underestimated their enemy. The Ethiopians attacked with precision, with coordination. With fury, the Italian army collapsed. Thousands were killed, thousands more captured. It was one of the most crushing defeats ever suffered by a colonial power in Africa. Italy was humiliated. Menelik became a hero across the continent, and Ethiopia, uniquely among African nations, remained uncolonized. But here's the misunderstanding. We don't talk about this war. We talk about Africa as a passive victim, a continent carved without resistance. But Ethiopia rewrote that script. The First Italo-Ethiopian War revealed the lie at the heart of colonial myth, that conquest was inevitable, that resistance was futile. Menelik proved otherwise, but history has a way of forgetting victories that don't fit the pattern, especially when those victories come from places we're taught to overlook. This war wasn't just military, it was psychological. It shattered the illusion of European invincibility, and it taught future generations in Africa and beyond that power can be challenged, that dignity can be defended, that the map is not destiny. Now as you drift deeper, you might picture the highlands of Ottawa, the rumble of hooves, the thunder of gunfire, the moment when history held its breath and did not go the way it was supposed to. And you might ask, if one empire can defy the ink of colonizers, what other stories have we mistaken for finished? There are wars that change history, and then there are wars that almost erase it. This is the War of the Triple Alliance, also known as the Paraguayan War, a conflict so devastating, so all-consuming, that an entire country nearly vanished, and yet few outside South America even know it happened. The year was 1864. Paraguay was led by Francisco Solano Lopez, a man shaped by ambition, paranoia, and admiration for Napoleon. Under his rule, Paraguay was militarized, disciplined, and fiercely independent. It was also landlocked, caught between Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, nations larger, richer, and tangled in regional politics. When civil war broke out in Uruguay, Lopez saw an opportunity to intervene, to reshape the balance of power, to make Paraguay a force to be reckoned with. But instead, he triggered catastrophe. Paraguay declared war on Brazil, then on Argentina, and by 1865, all three, Brazil, Argentina, and Uruguay, had formed the Triple Alliance together. They launched one of the most lopsided wars in modern history. Paraguay fought alone against three countries, with vastly superior resources, manpower, and navies. But Lopez refused to surrender. The war dragged on, year after year. Cities were razed, civilians starved, disease swept through camps. By the end, Paraguay lost over half its population. Some estimates suggest up to 90% of adult men were dead. The country was shattered, its economy, culture, and future gutted. And yet, the war is still misunderstood. Because to many, it looks suicidal. Why would a small nation challenge three giants? Why did Lopez provoke the war? Was he mad? Maybe, but maybe not entirely. Lopez believed, perhaps rightly, that Paraguay would never survive as long as it remained isolated. He feared encirclement, feared that Brazil and Argentina would divide the region. He believed war was inevitable, and if so, better to strike first. Was it a delusion or a doomed strategy? Historians still debate, because the truth is murky, warped by nationalist myths, lost documents, and the trauma of mass death. The War of the Triple Alliance doesn't fit easy narratives. It was neither just nor noble. It was slaughter on a national scale, an industrial tragedy before the age of industry, and perhaps that's why it's forgotten, because it didn't change borders much. It didn't redraw the world. It only destroyed a nation that dared to speak out of turn. Here's the paradox. Some wars are remembered for their impact, others for the silence that follows them. Paraguay survived, but only barely, and to this day, the scars remain in its demographics, its politics, its stories. Now, as you drift into stillness, imagine a land where nearly every man is gone, a generation erased, a country left to remember and to rebuild from almost nothing. And ask yourself, if a nation bleeds in silence, does history still hear it scream? They weren't called wars at first. They were called interventions, stabilizations, peacekeeping operations. But the boots landed, the guns fired, and the countries bled just the same. This is the story of the Banana Wars, a series of U.S. military occupations and interventions in Central America and the Caribbean that spanned more than 3 decades. The name sounds harmless, even absurd. But the damage runs deep. The root was economic, specifically bananas, and the companies that grew them in the early 1900s. The United Fruit Company, a powerful U.S. corporation, held vast plantations across nations like Honduras, Guatemala, Nicaragua, and Colombia. These weren't just farms, they were kingdoms, run by foreign capital, guarded by foreign soldiers, and woven tightly into the fabric of American interests. So when local workers resisted, when governments proposed reforms, when instability threatened the flow of fruit, the U.S. Marines arrived. Honduras was invaded 7 times between 1903 and 1925. In Nicaragua, troops stayed for over 2 decades. In Haiti, the U.S. rewrote the Constitution at gunpoint to allow foreign land ownership. Dominican Republic, occupied for 8 years. Cuba, intervention after intervention. None of these were declared wars. There were no formal battlefronts. But there were dead. There were prisons. There were puppet leaders and disappeared voices. The name, Banana Wars, reduces it all to a joke, as if fruit were the problem. But bananas were just the symbol. The truth is harder. It was about control, about empire without the name. This wasn't colonialism, they said. This was business. This was security. This was order. But for the people living beneath the shadow of those plantations, it felt like something else. There were resistance fighters, like Augusto Cesar Sandino in Nicaragua, who waged guerrilla war against the US occupation. He became a national hero. And a threat. He was assassinated in 1934. Not long after the US withdrew, his name lived on in revolution, in rebellion, in refusal. So here's what makes the Banana Wars so misunderstood. We don't call them wars, we call them policies. We study them through economics, not through grief. But they were wars, slow, scattered, and deeply effective. They built the image of the Banana Republic, a country dependent, hollowed out, ruled from afar. They taught generations that sovereignty could be bought and broken, and branded with someone else's logo. And we forget, not because it was unimportant, but because it was constant. It happened quietly, professionally, efficiently. No trench warfare, no headlines, just ships, soldiers, signatures, and silence. Now, as your breath slows, you might imagine a port somewhere in Honduras, sunlight on crates, boots on stone, and a flag that doesn't belong fluttering above the customs house. And you might ask, if empire no longer marches in uniform, does that make it any less real? It began with a shipment of drugs, not in the shadows, but in broad daylight, not smuggled by criminals, but pushed by an empire. This is the story of the Opium Wars, two conflicts that tore open the gates of China, not for freedom, but for trade, not for justice, but for addiction. The First War began in 1839. At its core was a strange demand. The British wanted to keep selling opium to the Chinese. The Chinese wanted them to stop. Opium, a powerful, addictive narcotic, had become a weapon of commerce. Britain, unable to balance its trade with China, found a solution: export opium from India into China, and watch the silver flow back. But the cost was human. By the 1830s, millions of Chinese were addicted. Families collapsed. Cities decayed. The Qing government, desperate, cracked down. They banned the trade. They seized opium stockpiles. They destroyed British shipments. Britain retaliated, not with negotiation, with warships. Gunboats steamed up the Chinese coast, shelling ports, forcing treaties. The Qing Empire, vast but technologically outmatched, could not hold. The Treaty of Nanking ended the First Opium War in 1842. It forced China to open ports, to pay reparations, to cede Hong Kong to Britain. But that wasn't enough. A second war followed in 1856, this time with both Britain and France demanding more access, more ports, more protections for Western citizens operating on Chinese soiled again. China lost again. The treaties were written in favor of empire. The name Opium Wars makes them sound niche, narrow. But what makes these wars so misunderstood is how central they were to modern history. These weren't simply drug disputes. They were wars of humiliation, moments when one civilization pried another open, for the sake of profit, and it worked. The treaties that followed were unequal by design. Western powers gained access to Chinese markets, extraterritorial rights, and control of key trade routes. China was left fractured, not conquered in name, but carved in spirit. The wars weakened the Qing dynasty. They planted the seeds of revolution, and they transformed Hong Kong from a sleepy island into one of the most contested cities in modern history. But, in Western memory, the Opium Wars are often reduced, barely mentioned, taught as trade disputes, or forgotten altogether, because they reveal something uncomfortable, that even the most civilized nations have built empires on addiction, that gunboats once protected narcotics, that free trade once meant forced consumption, and so we minimize them. Because to remember clearly would be to confront a very different version of ourselves now. As you close your eyes, you might picture a port filled with smoke, not from factories, but from burning opium. A war not fought for land, but for the right to poison, and you might ask, if freedom can be defended by selling addiction, what, exactly, were we ever free to choose? It was called a rebellion, a mutiny, a breakdown in order. But for those who lived through it, it felt like the sky itself had opened and fallen. This is the Indian Rebellion of 1857, also called the Sepoy Mutiny, or the First War of Independence, depending on who you ask. And that's the first misunderstanding. Even its name is contested, because naming a war is how you control its meaning. It began with a rumor that the British East India Company had coated its new rifle cartridges in animal fat, beef for Hindus, pork for Muslims. Soldiers had to bite the cartridge to load their rifles, and for many it felt like a deliberate defilement of faith. But the powder keg had already been filled. India, in the mid-19th century, was not a colony in the traditional sense. It was run by a company, a private enterprise, with its own army, its own currency, and its own laws. The British East India Company was a corporation with the power of a state, and the appetite of an empire. For years, it had eroded local kingdoms, undermined traditions, and drained wealth. So when Indian soldiers, sepoys, began to revolt, it wasn't just about cartridges. It was about dignity, about identity, about centuries of pressure. Finally erupting, the rebellion spread with terrifying speed. Delhi, Kanpur, Lucknow, cities that had been quiet 1 month were battlegrounds the next. But the British didn't call it a war. They called it a mutiny, a breakdown in loyalty, as if the fault was individual, not systemic. They responded with overwhelming force. Villages were burned, civilians executed, entire towns erased to set examples. The rebellion failed. Militarily, it was crushed, but politically, it changed everything. The East India Company, so powerful, so untouchable, was dissolved. The British Crown took direct control of India. What had been a corporate empire became a royal one. And here lies the paradox. The war that Britain tried to erase, the war it tried to frame as insubordination, ended up reconfiguring the entire colonial structure. It revealed that India was not a passive possession, that revolt was possible, that even empires built on profit can be shaken by memory and myth. In the decades that followed, the seeds of nationalism took root. The echoes of 1857 grew louder with each generation. And though it would take 90 more years, independence was no longer unthinkable. The war in heaven, as some poets later called it, was not divine, but it was sacred in its defiance. What makes this war so misunderstood isn't its tactics or its failure, but how close it came to rewriting everything, and how hard the victors worked to make sure we remember it differently. So as you fall gently, now, into sleep, into stillness, picture the dust rising from sepoy boots, the torn banners of broken regiments, the clash of old gods against new flags, and ask yourself, if the first blow doesn't win the war, can it still be the beginning of the end? This war began with a cat, or at least that's how the stories remember it. A monastery, a stolen sheep, a hungry cat, and suddenly 2 powerful rulers were on the brink of battle. This is the War of St. Sardos, a name long since buried. beneath the dust of history, but sometimes whispered as the War of the Whiskers, not because of its causes, but because of how foolish it seemed. And yet, behind the absurdity, lay the quiet foundations of something much larger. The 100 Years' War. The year was 1324. The place, Aquitaine, a region in modern-day southwestern France. At the time, it was ruled by Edward II of England, though technically he held it as a vassal of the French king Charles IV. It was an arrangement destined for tension, a king who had to bow on paper to another, but things held, until a monk at the small priory of St. Sardos built a fortified wall on land disputed between French and English authority. A wall. That's all. The English saw it as an affront, a creeping claim by the French. When English allied nobles raided the priory and hanged the monk. It should have been a local matter, handled with care, resolved with letters. But instead, the French saw an opportunity, a chance to push, to remind Edward II of his place, and Edward. He refused to kneel. Diplomacy broke. Skirmishes spread. French forces invaded Aquitaine. The war had begun, not with a declaration, but with a single dead monk, a disputed wall, and an insult that echoed all the way to Paris. What makes this war so misunderstood isn't just its strange beginning. It's that it wasn't supposed to matter, and yet it became the first spark in what would become one of the longest wars in European history. The War of St. Sardos only lasted a few months, but it ruptured trust. It deepened the rift between England and France. It revealed just how unstable the feudal balance truly was. And when Edward III took the throne, barely a decade later, he would invoke this very conflict as part of his claim to the French crown, the opening move of the 100 Years' War. So here's the paradox. The War of the Whiskers feels like farce, a squabble over land and paperwork, a dead monk, a petty raid. But behind it was a slow collision of sovereignty, pride, and dynastic ambition. The monk was never the cause, only the signal, and history is full of such signals. Moments we laugh at until we follow their shadows far enough to find the fire. So now, as the lights dim and you drift towards stillness, picture a lonely priory, a ruined wall, a kingdom trying to hold on to pride with parchment and swords, and ask yourself, if the war that changed Europe began with a monk and a stone wall, how many revolutions have already begun while we were looking the other way? This war began with a cat, or at least that's how the stories remember it. A monastery, a stolen sheep, a hungry cat, and suddenly two powerful rulers were on the brink of battle. This is the War of St. Sardos, a name long since buried beneath the dust of history, but sometimes whispered as the War of the Whiskers, not because of its causes, but because of how foolish it seemed. And yet, behind the absurdity, lay the quiet foundations of something much larger. The 100 Years' War. The year was 1324. The place, Aquitaine, a region in modern-day southwestern France. At the time, it was ruled by Edward II of England, though technically he held it as a vassal of the French king, Charles IV. It was an arrangement destined for tension, a king who had to bow on paper to another, but things held, until a monk at the small priory of St. Sardos built a fortified wall on land disputed between French and English authority. A wall. That's all the English saw it as an affront, a creeping claim by the French. When English allied nobles raided the priory and hanged the monk, it should have been a local matter, handled with care, resolved with letters. But instead, the French saw an opportunity, a chance to push, to remind Edward II of his place, and Edward, he refused to kneel. Diplomacy broke, skirmishes spread, French forces invaded Aquitaine. The war had begun, not with a declaration, but with a single dead monk, a disputed war, and an insult that echoed all the way to Paris. What makes this war so misunderstood isn't just its strange beginning. It's that it wasn't supposed to matter, and yet it became the first spark in what would become one of the longest wars in European history. The War of St. Sardos only lasted a few months, but it ruptured trust. It deepened the rift between England and France. It revealed just how unstable the feudal balance truly was. And when Edward III took the throne, barely a decade later, he would invoke this very conflict as part of his claim to the French crown, the opening move of the 100 Years' War. So here's the paradox. The War of the Whiskers feels like farce, a squabble over land and paperwork, a dead monk, a petty raid. But behind it was a slow collision of sovereignty, pride, and dynastic ambition. The monk was never the cause, only the signal, and history is full of such signals. Moments we laugh at. It wasn't supposed to be a war. It was supposed to be a survey error, a line drawn slightly too high or too low, a cartographic hiccup. But people don't fight over lines. They fight over what the lines represent. This is the Toledo War, a nearly bloodless but fiercely territorial conflict between the state of Ohio and the Michigan Territory. And like so many misunderstood wars, it wasn't about what it claimed to be. It began with a strip of land, 468 square miles, known as the Toledo Strip, a narrow borderland between Michigan and Ohio, thin, unassuming, but strategically valuable, because it held access to Lake Erie and the potential for canal commerce that would shape the region's economy. Both sides believed the land was theirs, and both had documents to prove it. Maps made under the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 were vague. Subsequent surveys contradicted one another. The Harris Line and the Fulton Line drew different versions of truth, and when the Michigan Territory, eager for statehood, began asserting control, Ohio responded. The two sent militias, not armies, but armed men, marching through woods and farmland, not to fight, but to hold ground. Forts were built, roads were blockaded, flags were raised, and tension thickened like fog over flat plains. The most famous exchange, a single gunshot, fired into the air by an overzealous sheriff. No one was hurt, but the violence wasn't the point. The real struggle was legal, political, existential. For Michigan, the Toledo Strip symbolized its readiness to be a state, to claim land, to self-govern. For Ohio, it was about prestige and power. They were already a state, and they would not be undermined by a territory. President Andrew Jackson was forced to intervene, not with force, but with compromise. In 1836, a deal was struck. Michigan would give up the Toledo Strip. In return, it would receive the western part of the Upper Peninsula. At the time, Michigan was furious. They felt cheated. Toledo was fertile, developed, and industrial. The Upper Peninsula, remote, barren, frozen. But history is strange. Decades later, the Upper Peninsula would become rich in iron, copper, and timber, a treasure trove of natural resources that helped power Michigan's rise. And Toledo, it grew, but not in two. A capital of empire. So here's the misunderstanding. We remember the Toledo War as a curiosity, a border dispute with no real fighting. But beneath the trivia lies the quiet machinery of American expansion. This was not a joke. It was a test of legitimacy, of how borders are enforced, not by geography, but by politics, persistence, and paperwork. It was a war without war, but not without meaning now. As you settle deeper, picture two militias staring at one another across a forest clearing. No hatred, no blood, just a line in the dirt, and two groups of people told it matters more than anything else. And ask yourself, if no one dies in a war, but identity is forever changed, did the war still leave scars? Until we follow their shadows far enough to find the fire. So now, as the lights dim and you drift towards stillness, picture a lonely priory, a ruined wall, a kingdom trying to hold on to pride with parchment and swords, and ask yourself, if the war that changed Europe began with a monk and a stone wall, how many revolutions have already begun while we were looking the other way? It was a war where no battles were fought, where no soldiers died in combat, and yet thousands marched into frozen woods, ready to defend a border that almost no one could find on a map. This is the Aroostook War, sometimes called the Pork and Beans War, a conflict between the United States and British Canada that nearly sparked something far larger over land that neither side truly understood. The roots lay in a line, or rather, the absence of one. After the Treaty of Paris in 1783 ended the American Revolution, the boundary between Maine and British-controlled New Brunswick was left vague. Surveyors disagreed. Maps contradicted one another. Each side interpreted the forest differently. Each claimed the Aroostook River Valley. And for decades, nothing happened until people moved in. Loggers, farmers, speculators, American settlers, mostly from Maine, began to cut timber on lands the British believed were theirs. Canadian lumbermen, in turn, crossed into what the Americans considered their territory. And suddenly, trees became weapons. In 1838, tensions erupted. The state of Maine sent a militia. The British responded with their own troops. No one fired. A shot, but both sides built forts, established patrols, and began arresting one another's citizens. Over 10,000 troops were eventually mobilized. Snow fell heavy. The land was remote, bitterly cold, and impossibly vast. But it wasn't the terrain that made this war strange. It was the confusion. No one wanted war. Not truly, but pride had been wounded, and neither side would back down. President Martin Van Buren tried to calm things. So did British officials in London. But the men on the ground, the governors, the officers, the local militias, all stood firm, because to retreat felt like surrender. Here's where the war becomes most misunderstood. It wasn't about Aroostook. It wasn't about the trees. It was about the American obsession with manifest destiny, with lines that define power, with national pride drawn in pencil, waiting to be inked with blood, if necessary. Eventually, both governments agreed to arbitration. The result was the Webster-Ashburton Treaty of 1842. The boundary was settled. The war was over. Quietly, without glory, and yet, it left behind something more enduring than victory. A realization that even in the absence of violence, war leaves a mark. The people who lived in those forests learned that their homes could be claimed by strangers, that their borders could change overnight. That peace is not always chosen, but negotiated under pressure. And today, the Aroostook War is remembered, if at all, as a harmless footnote, a war without blood, a joke between neighbors. But the deeper truth is this: Peace is rarely peaceful, even when the guns stay silent. Now, as your thoughts soften and your eyes close, picture a frozen river. Soldiers shivering in wool coats, axes biting into bark, flags rising above pine trees, both believing they stand on their own land. And ask yourself, if no shots are fired, but everyone is ready to die, did the war ever truly stay cold? It was supposed to be a match, just a game, 90 minutes, a ball, a crowd, a winner. But the final whistle didn't end the story. It started a war. This is the Soccer War, also known as the 100-Hour War, a brief, violent conflict between El Salvador and Honduras in 1969, often dismissed as absurd. A war over a World Cup qualifier. But the truth is deeper, and far more haunting. The match was real. So was the rage. El Salvador and Honduras faced each other in a best-of-3 playoff for a spot in the 1970 World Cup. The games were vicious. The crowds hostile, flags burned, national anthems booed. And after the final game, El Salvador won and severed diplomatic ties. Just days later, planes took off, tanks rolled forward, bullets flew. But it wasn't about soccer. It never was. The game was just the matchstick. The fuel had been building for years. By the late 1960s, Honduras had one of the most unequal land distributions in the Americas. A handful of wealthy landowners controlled vast tracts, while poor farmers, many of them Salvadoran migrants, worked the soil without ownership, without security, without future. Over 300,000 Salvadorans had crossed into Honduras in search of land, only to be blamed for unemployment, for squatting, for changing the culture. Honduran land reforms, backed by the elite, targeted these migrants. Families were evicted. Homes were burned. The border grew tense. And when the World Cup lit the flame, the war erupted. El Salvador invaded on July 14, 1969. The fighting lasted just 4 days, but over 3,000 people died, most of them civilians. Entire villages were shelled. Children disappeared. Refugees poured across the borders, carrying what little they had left in their hands. The Organization of American States eventually brokered a ceasefire. El Salvador withdrew, but the wounds didn't. The border remained closed for over a decade. Trade was suspended. The bitterness deepened, and here's the trap. Because it was called the Soccer War, we forget the bodies. We laugh at the name. We treat it as trivia. But this was a war about displacement, about land, about migration and memory and fear. Soccer was never the cause, only the mirror, reflecting deeper tensions that neither government wanted to confront. It's easy to blame a game, harder to face the inequality behind it. So here's the paradox. The most visible part of a conflict is rarely the most important. The ball rolls, the fans shout, but the war starts long before the stadium fills. Now, as you sink into quiet, picture a child running barefoot through a field, not toward a soccer ball, but away from smoke, from a home that no longer stands, from a story that no one will tell. And ask yourself, if a war wears the face of a game, does that make the grief any less real? You've heard this one before, or at least you think you have. A war between men and birds in Australia, and the birds won. It sounds like satire, a footnote in history written by a comedian. But the Great Emu War of 1932 was no joke, not to the men who fought it, and certainly not to the farmers whose livelihoods were trampled beneath 6-foot feathers. The setting is Western Australia. Just after World War I, thousands of veterans, promised land for their service, were struggling to grow wheat in the dry, unforgiving soil. The Great Depression had struck hard. Prices plummeted. Support evaporated. And then came the emus. They arrived by the thousands, fleeing the inland heat, drawn by the water sources and crop fields of newly cleared farmland. They tore through fences, trampled young crops, spread like a living tide across the region. Desperate, the farmers turned to the government. And the government, perhaps half serious, perhaps half desperate, sent the army armed with Lewis machine guns. Major G.P.W. Meredith and his men launched the campaign in November 1932. The mission reduced the emu population, but there was a problem. The birds were faster than expected, stronger, wilder. They scattered in unpredictable bursts. They absorbed gunfire and kept moving. The terrain was open, vast, and uncooperative. On the first day, a group of 50 birds were spotted. The gunners set up, fired. They killed maybe a dozen. The rest vanished into the brush. Another attempt followed. More rounds, more missed targets. Guns jammed. Emus outran trucks. They zigzagged through the wheat like ghosts. After several weeks, and over 2,500 rounds fired, only around 1,000 birds were confirmed dead. The rest had simply evaded, and so the war ended. Not with victory, but with retreat. The military withdrew. The emus remained. The press had a field day. And the farmers were left, once again, to fend for themselves. It's easy to laugh, too. Call it the most ridiculous war in history. But the real misunderstanding isn't the birds. It's the desperation that sent men with machine guns to fight creatures with feathers. The Great Emu War wasn't about pests. It was about failed promises. About a government that rewarded service with silence, that responded to economic collapse. With symbolic gestures, the soldiers weren't mock heroes. They were veterans, once called to fight in Europe, now told to aim at birds in a dry field, because no one knew what else to do. And the emus, they weren't invaders. They were survivors, adapting, filling a space that humans had claimed, but couldn't fully tame. So here's the paradox. The Great Emu War is funny only if you forget what it represents. It's tragic if you remember that it was never really a war, just a moment when policy collapsed and nature refused to obey. Now, as your breathing slows and the Australian dusk settles across the wheat, picture a lone machine gun crew watching. 100 birds vanish into the twilight. No targets, no victory. Just wind and dust and the silence of something unsolved. And ask yourself, if the enemy cannot be defeated, was the war ever real, or just a story we told to distract ourselves? From the collapse, the newspapers screamed of war, mobilization, declarations, lines drawn in blood, but then nothing. This is the phony war. A stretch of months during World War II, when Europe was technically at war, but the guns were quiet. After Germany invaded Poland on September 1st, 1939, Britain and France declared war 2 days later. World War II had begun, and yet, for the next 7 months, Western Europe remained eerily still. No invasions across the French border. No Allied offensives. Just speeches, posturing, and a silence thick with dread. It came to be called the Sitzkrieg, by some a sitting war. The press dubbed it the phony war, as if it were a bluff, an act, a war without war. But here's the First misunderstanding. It wasn't phony at all. While nothing moved on the Western Front, Poland was being crushed. Its cities burned, its armies overwhelmed. And from the east, the Soviets invaded, tearing the country in two under a secret pact with Hitler. The silence in the West wasn't peace. It was paralysis. In France, over 3 million soldiers manned the Maginot Line, a sprawling, heavily fortified border defense. But their guns pointed in the wrong direction, toward a type of war that no longer existed. In Britain, blackouts were enforced. Children were evacuated. Gas masks issued. Citizens waited for the bombs that hadn't come yet. And in Berlin, Hitler was preparing. He didn't mind the delay. He used it to plan, to move troops, to break Scandinavia, to perfect blitzkrieg. The phony war wasn't a lull. It was a countdown. But the second misunderstanding is deeper. The idea that nothing happening meant nothing mattered, because something did happen in those quiet months. Doubt. People questioned the resolve of their leaders. They wondered whether the war was real, whether it could be avoided, bargained away, explained into nothing. But history doesn't work that way, and evil doesn't pause because we hesitate. In May 1940, the phony ended. Germany invaded France, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Luxembourg. In a single sweep, the Maginot Line was bypassed. Paris fell in 6 weeks. The silence was shattered, and the world realized too late that a quiet war is not a safe one. So here's the paradox. The phony war is remembered as a gap in the story, an interruption between the drama of the beginning and the horror of what followed. But in truth, it was the mirror, a reflection of how unprepared we often are to face what we know is coming. We call it phony to soothe ourselves, to say we weren't wrong. Nothing happened, but something did. We waited now, as you drift in the hush before sleep. Picture a soldier standing watch on a quiet border, the wind cold, the sky empty, the ground trembling with a war not yet arrived, and ask yourself, if silence follows a declaration of war, is it a reprieve, or the sound of something worse, being prepared? It hangs in a tower, even now, wooden, simple, weathered by centuries, a bucket, not golden, not ceremonial, just a plain pail, suspended behind glass in the city of Modena, Italy. And once this bucket started a war. This is the War of the Bucket, fought in 1325 between the rival city-states of Modena and Bologna. And like so many wars in this list, it's remembered for the wrong reasons. The popular version is this: some Modenese soldiers snuck into Bologna, stole a bucket from a city well, and took it back to Modena in triumph. Bologna demanded its return. Modena refused. Insults were traded. And then armies. Over 30,000 men clashed in the Battle of Zappolino. Modena won decisively, and the bucket stayed. It sounds absurd, and it is, if you stop there. But the misunderstanding lies in how we simplify. Absurdity. Because no one really goes to war over a pail. The bucket was a symbol, an excuse, a focal point for something much older, deeper, and far more dangerous. At the time, northern Italy was a chessboard of shifting alliances, cities aligned with either the Guelphs, who supported the Pope, or the Ghibellines, loyal to the Holy Roman Emperor. Bologna was a proud Guelph stronghold. Modena, staunchly Ghibelline. Their rivalry stretched back generations. Disputes over borders, trade, power, pride. Skirmishes flared regularly. And the political map was a tapestry woven with tension. The stolen bucket, it was just the spark. The kindling had been piled high for years, and when war broke out, it wasn't just about property, it was about dominance. The bucket became the symbol of Modena's defiance, their proof that they could invade, humiliate, and retreat untouched after the battle. They celebrated by building a well in their city center, using water from Bologna's spring, a gesture as mocking as it was strategic. The war lasted only days, but the implications lingered. It deepened regional divisions, reinforced the idea that honor, even stolen in the form of a wooden object, was worth blood. So here's the deeper misunderstanding. We laugh at the name. We teach it as trivia. We forget the bodies. But this was not a war about a bucket. It was a war about power dressed in comedy. An absurd surface masking a brutal reality. Just like so many other wars. And maybe that's the point. That symbols are never really silly. Not when people are willing to die for them. The bucket became a story, then a myth, then a trophy, and now, as the centuries fold into night, it hangs in Modena like a relic of misplaced priorities, or, perhaps, a warning. So as you drift beneath your own ceiling of silence, picture two armies marching toward one. Another, not for land, not for gold, but for a bucket that was never really about itself. And ask yourself, if every war has a symbol, how many symbols do we mistake for truth? It began with a flag, a white chrysanthemum on a red field, the imperial symbol of Japan. But this time, it was not flying over a court. It was raised in rebellion. This is the Boshin War, a civil war that transformed Japan from a feudal nation of samurai and shoguns into a centralized modern empire. And like most misunderstood wars, it didn't start where you'd expect. In the mid-1800s, Japan was changing. After more than 2 centuries of isolation, Western powers had forced the country to open its ports. Gunboats in the harbors, unequal treaties signed in candlelit halls. The world was entering Japan, and Japan was splintering from within. At the center of it all stood the Tokugawa shogunate, the military rulers of Japan for over 250 years. They held power, they enforced order, but they did not wear the chrysanthemum that belonged to the emperor. For centuries, the emperor had been a spiritual figure, symbolic, distant, divine. But as dissatisfaction grew, a movement emerged to restore him as the true ruler of Japan. It was not just about monarchy, it was about modernity, about whether Japan would adapt on its own terms or be swallowed by foreign powers. In 1868, the emperor, Meiji, declared his restoration. The shogun refused to step down. War erupted. The Boshin War pitted pro-imperial forces from southwestern domains like Satsuma and CHSH against the traditionalist forces loyal to the shogunate. Samurai faced samurai. Old loyalties fractured. New weapons clashed with ancient armor. Battles raged from Kyoto to Edo, modern-day Tokyo. Castles fell. Railways were seized. Ships exchanged cannon fire in Japan's bays. The emperor's side won. In just over a year, the Tokugawa regime collapsed. The Meiji Restoration began. But what makes the Boshin War so misunderstood isn't just that it was short, it's that it was quietly revolutionary. It didn't end with a parade. It ended with a transformation. Japan abolished the samurai class. It built a conscript army. It adopted Western dress, industry, education. In a single generation, it leaped into the modern age. But at a cost. Thousands died. Entire ways of life vanished. Families who had worn swords for generations now traded them for suits. The war wasn't just political, it was psychological. The symbol of the emperor, once distant, became a tool of central power, a unifying myth for an empire that would later wield that chrysanthemum on flags that flew far beyond Japan's shores. So here's the paradox. The Boshin War is remembered as a transition, a page turned, but it was also a rupture, and like all ruptures, it left behind quiet fractures. Now, as you drift into stillness, imagine the last of the shogun's forces retreating to Hokkaido, founding a short-lived republic, a final breath before vanishing. And ask yourself, if a war rewrites a nation so completely, can you still find its old name beneath the ink? Some wars are fought over empires, some over borders, some over salt. This is the Salt War, a little-known uprising in the American Southwest, where local resistance clashed with ambition, greed, and the slow tightening grip of power. The setting was El Paso County, Texas, just after the Civil War. The borderlands between the United States and Mexico were tense, layered, unstable. Communities were bilingual, multi-ethnic, and land-rich, but politically fragile for generations. The salt lakes at Guadalupe Mountains had been freely accessed by locals, Mexican-American families, farmers, traders. Salt wasn't just seasoning. It was currency, a necessity, a symbol of communal rights, and for generations it was understood. Salt belonged to everyone, but when white American businessmen, backed by expanding railroads and Texas law, moved to privatize the salt beds, everything changed. One man, Charles Howard, claimed exclusive ownership. He erected barriers, threatened trespassers, and declared that salt would now be bought, not gathered. The community resisted. Not through protests, through action. Armed groups began to organize. They weren't anarchists. They were defending tradition, memory, an unwritten contract that was now being torn apart. Tensions boiled. Howard was arrested by the local court, then released in retaliation. He ambushed and killed several community leaders. The region exploded. This wasn't a battlefield war. It was a war of ambushes, sieges, and retribution. In December 1877, Howard and his men were surrounded in San Elizario by a militia of Mexican-American fighters. After a long standoff, he surrendered. The next day, he was executed by firing squad. The state of Texas responded with force. Texas Rangers arrived. Dozens were arrested. Others fled south into Mexico. The insurrection was crushed, and the salt, it remained privatized. So here's the misunderstanding. The Salt War is often written off as a skirmish, a footnote in Western expansion, an isolated land dispute. But it wasn't. It was about communal rights versus capital control, about identity and who defines ownership when laws change, but memory does not. It was a clash between people whose ancestors had lived on that land before it was called Texas, before the border shifted, before paper overrode custom. The Salt War revealed that conquest doesn't end with treaties. It continues through economics, through courts, through the slow erasure of collective rights in favor of individual claims. Now, as you fall into the quiet of night, picture the salt flats shimmering under the desert sun. Men on horseback, no uniforms, just belief, and the fading sound of a right being taken, grain by grain. And ask yourself, if history is written by the winners, who owns the land when memory and law no longer speak the same language? It wasn't just a chair. It wasn't even a throne. It was a soul, and when the British demanded to sit on it, they declared war without knowing it. This is the War of the Golden Stool, fought in 1900 in what is now Ghana, between the British Empire and the Ashanti people, over an object that no outsider could touch without defiling everything it meant to defend. The Golden Stool, or Sika Dwa Kofi, was not a symbol of monarchy. It was monarchy. It represented the unity of the Ashanti kingdom, not just political power, but ancestral presence. It held the spirits of the living and the dead, a sacred seat that no one, not even the king, could sit on. And yet, that's exactly what the British demanded. By 1900, the Ashanti had already fought for wars against British encroachment. Each time, they resisted fiercely. Each time, the British pushed harder. They wanted gold, trade, control. They exiled the Ashanti king, Prempa I, and thought the kingdom subdued. But then came Governor Frederick Hodgson, arrogant, assured. He stood before Ashanti leaders in their capital and made a demand that the Golden Stool be brought to him, that he, a foreign administrator, should sit on it to signify British rule. The silence was heavy, but the insult was louder. No war was declared, but it had already begun. Ashanti warriors rose overnight. The city of Kumasi was surrounded. Hodgson and his forces were besieged for months, trapped, hungry, helpless. They eventually escaped. But the British returned with reinforcements. They looted, they razed, they punished. Still, they never found the stool. It had been hidden by Ashanti priests and elders, moved from place to place, guarded not with weapons, but with reverence. Years later, the stool was accidentally discovered by laborers, who, not knowing its sacred status, stripped it of gold. They were tried and punished, not by the British, but by Ashanti law. What makes this war so misunderstood is how often it's trivialized, reduced to an object, dismissed as a cultural misunderstanding. But it wasn't misunderstanding. It was disregard. It was empire mistaking sacredness for spectacle. To the British, it was furniture. To the Ashanti, it was life. The War of the Golden Stool didn't last long, but it echoed for generations. In that moment, the Ashanti showed that some things would not be conquered, not by guns, not by treaties, not by disrespect. Eventually, the British established control, but never fully. The Ashanti spirit endured, quietly, under the surface. Waiting in 1935, the British finally recognized the Ashanti Confederacy once more, a symbolic return of sovereignty, a quiet admission that not everything could be absorbed now. As your breath slows and night gathers in the corners of your room, picture a golden seat buried beneath the forest floor, untouched, unseen, but never forgotten, and ask yourself if the soul of a people can live in a stool. How many wars have we started by refusing to believe in what others hold sacred? You've heard of 25 wars tonight. Some lasted days, some centuries, some spilled oceans of blood. Others were fought in silence, over salt, over maps, over buckets, over symbols so strange they seemed like fables. But none of them were really about what they claimed to be. That's the truth history rarely says out loud. That war is rarely honest. It wears a mask of honor, of law, of necessity. But beneath that mask is often land, power, fear, and insult turned into invasion. A ritual mistaken for rebellion. A memory rewritten until it fits the victor's tongue. We laugh at the Emu War. We forget the Triple Alliance. We condense decades of suffering into a sentence and call it a summary. But now, in the quiet after all these stories, something lingers. A question you can't quite shake. If so many wars were misunderstood, then how many more have we misunderstood still? And if conflict can begin with something as small as a word, a wall, a seed, or a chair, then maybe the real war is the one we never knew we were already in. Good night.